Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to the Where Are the Aliens panel. In this panel, we'll tackle the famous Fermi paradox, as it's often called. And the question is already in the title of the panel. And we might wonder, where are all the aliens if there ever had been any other intelligent civilization in our galaxy? Because if they invented means to travel between the stars, even with speeds much lower than the speed of light, they should be able to colonize the galaxy in mere millions of years. So where are they? We haven't detected any signal, we haven't found any probe, we haven't met any aliens or anything like that. And there are many possible hypotheses trying to explain this question and this lack of evidence of alien civilizations in our galaxy. And before we start tackling the question, I would like to introduce the panelists. So on my right is Ian Waite. He's a very prolific author and editor of speculative fiction. He wrote 6 novels, many short stories, and edited more than 30 anthologies, including one anthology on the Fermi paradox. And he is the director of the British Science Fiction Association. And on my left is Jonathan Cowie. He's an environmental scientist and science communicator, also very prolific. And most recently, he published a 2nd edition of his book, Climate Change, Biological and Human Aspects. And Earth system science and climate change in particular are the topics he engages in most. And he is also a member of the Science Fact and Science Fiction, and I hope I pronounced this right, concatenation? Yes.
Concatenation, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to start with you. What's your view of the Fermi paradox, and what hypothesis do you consider most likely to explain it?
Oh, gosh. Put it for you, first. Well, as a scientist, I must actually, first of all, declare that I'm completely biased because I'm also a science fiction enthusiast.
Maybe closer.
I'm also a science fiction enthusiast, and I would really like it that there would be lots of aliens out there. So I'm aware that within me there is a conscious bias. However, I do think that if you actually look at the question of the Fermi paradox closely. When we were at school, we were always taught experimentation, hypothesis, experimentation, conclusion, and you must always list your assumptions. And I think that there are quite a few assumptions inherent in the Fermi paradox. The first assumption is that the aliens will want to colonize the galaxy. And that assumption is born of the fact that our civilization, our technical civilization, has been built upon long-term quasi-exponential growth. If there are any demographers amongst you, you'll realize why I said quasi. But our population has grown and our energy use per capita has grown with time, with a huge surge around the time of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, we went through a phase in the mid-1970s where the population growth was super exponential. That is, there was exponential growth on it. The exponential growth was itself growing. And this has coloured our thinking, because wherever you are on a growth curve like that, looking back looks the same as looking forward with the rate of change. And your life in this rate of change, in that sense, was similar to your grandparents' life, even though your grandparents lived in a more simpler world without the internet, without this, that, and the other. So I think there are inherent assumptions. Would the aliens really necessarily want to colonize the galaxy? I think there are other explanations, but I think Ian should have a crack.
Well, my own view, and the thing is, as Jonathan said, there are so many theories on why we haven't yet encountered alien life forms. I have two particular favourites, which I find it hard to choose between. One is simply that we are a form of life that's grown up on a planet where virtually all life, okay, you can go back to bacterial stages and say that it doesn't necessarily comply, but virtually all life is based on a very similar format, on a very similar blueprint of what life is. And I think because of that, we're looking for life that's along the same lines. And I suspect that if we're going to find alien life, it could be more alien than we've ever envisaged. And I think that SETI's project, which is wonderful, and I would love it to bits if it did find something. And I know recently there's been suggestions that certain signals might represent intelligent communication or some sort of a byproduct of civilized life, but I'm yet to be convinced on that. But I think we're looking for the sort of things that our civilization and our type of life would produce. And I think perhaps that we're thinking inside the box, and that to actually discover alien life, we're going to have to think a long way outside the box. So that's one thing I like. And the other thing is something which was first mooted many years ago and has again come to prevalence recently, and that is the nature of our sun. Our sun, in terms of the cosmos, is actually quite a youngish sun. And quite an old sun, and it's gone a certain stage down its life cycle where it can now support life. And the theory is that many of the suns out there, particularly the smaller suns, are a long way from reaching the sort of emission stage, the sort of radiation stage that our sun's at, and that actually it could be millions upon millions of years before the majority of suns in the cosmos are at a state where they can actually support a planet with life on it. So it may well be that the reason SETI isn't picking anything up is that we are one of the first civilizations, and that millions of years later, other civilizations will be looking upon us as the older civilization, in the same way that in SF we look upon older races. And I quite like that theory. Of course, there are many others, but those two are my two favourites at the moment.
I would quite like to challenge you on that. I think there's some substance in what you said. And it's absolutely true. There are a lot more smaller, redder, long-lived suns than there are our orangey.
Yes, actually, the G-type stars, like our sun, constitute like 5 to 15% of stars in the universe.
So that's true, but nonetheless, there are still an awful lot of them. Having said that there's still an awful lot of them, you've got to divide that very roughly by 2, because roughly half the stars in the spiral arms are in binary pairs. However, going back to the earliest stars, which seem to be large hydrogen giants, which did not last very long, then the second generation stars came along fairly quickly. And the current research, I read Nature every week, Nature is one of the leading science journals in the world. The other one is Science, the leading multidisciplinary journal. Science is published in America, Nature is published in Europe. And I like one of the, my favorite science reporter works for Science, the American one. But Nature, which is published in Europe, has on the back page a one-page science fiction story each week, and Ian had a story published in it. I've now sidetracked myself completely.
I'll just interject and say actually 4 in there.
Actually, you started about red dwarf suns. And I think that maybe you wanted to say that there are lots of them that could actually support life.
Well, no, I was going to say that there were the earliest G-type stars have been around quite a while ago. The red-type stars have a problem in that you have to be quite close to them in order to have the thermal temperature. That's problem number 1. And with that comes the fact that the planet runs the risk of becoming tidally locked, or I should say semi-tidally locked, because the latest research is that if the planet has an atmosphere, which if it was going to have life, it would have an atmosphere, it isn't quite tidally locked, but that's by the by. But I think there is a third bigger problem, and that is the red-type stars produce light of a lower energy than our G-type stars, and that means energy for photosynthesis is not there. Now, there is a way of getting around it, which I won't bore you with unless you're into biology. But if you are into biology, basically it means sticking together in the Z diagram of photosynthesis another loop. And that's theoretically possible if you've got plenty of time to do it in. And here comes the yet again caveat. The red-type stars, which are cooler, because they're cooler, even though they're smaller, they don't burn so fast, and therefore they live a lot longer. So that theoretically, you could say there is time for this to happen. But I am doubtful of that.
Actually, Jonathan, I'd like to interject here, because for me, the biggest problem of M-type stars or red dwarfs is that many of them, if not all of them, are flare stars, which means that they can undergo very violent eruptions of the stellar plasma, which could strip the planet of its atmosphere and destroy any life present there. But actually, it doesn't seem to be so negative for life, because there are things how to go around that. For example, if the planet had a large inclination, because most of the flare happen around the star's equator, and if we have the ecliptic, sort of the plane around the star's equator, we can have the planet orbiting like this with a large inclination, large angle to the ecliptic. Of course, most planets don't do that. And in our own systems, all the planets are in the ecliptic with negligible inclination, and only dwarf planets like Pluto or Sedna or Eris have large inclinations. But we can imagine a system where this would be possible for a planet near the star, and also in case that the planet would, for example, have a thick ice layer on its surface, like the icy moons of our own solar system, that would protect possible life beneath that. But of course, that introduces another problem. How would such a life develop a technological civilization? And I would like to correct a faux pas of not introducing myself. Sorry for that. I'm Julie Nováková. I'm an evolutionary biologist from Prague, the Czech Republic. And I'm also a science fiction author and science communicator. So that's this. And actually, both the motivation for interstellar flight, as you said, it's a big assumption on our side, and the assumption that alien life will be similar to ours are big constraints in what are we looking for. And they are useful constraints because, for example, if we want to look for planets where we might detect biosignatures, we are looking for the so-called second Earths, because we know what to expect there. We don't know what biosignatures to expect from life that would evolve, for example, in methane seas of Titan or in other very exotic environments. But the question stands nevertheless, because even if most of the life was not carbon-based, not similar to ours, or most civilizations didn't want to venture into the galaxy, would it apply to all of them? Because just one civilization that would want to explore the galaxy and would have the means could colonize it in millions of years.
Well, I think there is also a science fictional solution. And this science fiction solution is predicated on a combination of the John Scalzi Old Man's War scenario, in which the universe is actually quite heavily populated with intelligence and real estate is quite rare. Now, making an assumption, I mean, if Fermi's going to make assumptions in his paradox, then we should be allowed to make assumptions. Assuming that an advanced civilization is also morally and technically advanced compared to our own, they may want the nature reserve hypothesis. However, you could say well, fair dues, but humanity as a civilization has only been around for a tiny fraction of the Earth's history. Why didn't the aliens come and colonize the Earth? Okay, for those of you who are into science, there is actually a new theory of life and evolution of life being developed. It's very new. It's only been really developed in a strong sense over the past 10 years. The textbook for it is unfortunately a textbook. It's published by Oxford University Press, which is a respectable publisher in Britain, academic publisher in Britain. And the book is by Timothy Lenton and Andrew Watson, both of whom are now professors at Exeter University, but when they wrote the book, they were professors at different places. One was at Stirling, one was at University of East Anglia. And the book's called The Revolutions That Made the Earth. And basically, the assumption, the thesis is this, is that in ultra simple terms, if biology is a true science, then there are things about biology should be common on other worlds that are Earth-like, as they are here. But there'll be some things about life on Earth that are unique to life on Earth, and there'll be some things about life on Earth that were in common with all carbon-based life elsewhere. They go on and present the history of how life evolved on Earth in energetic and elemental cycling terms. It does hang together. You'd have to read it to understand it. Unfortunately, there is at the moment only this one book which is aimed at undergraduate, second-year undergraduate students. But hopefully within a few years there will actually be a popular science version coming out, and it'll become common knowledge. But if their thesis is true, what it means is you can actually predict, and that means we will very soon, because we're developing this understanding, which Earth-like planets we're observing elsewhere are likely to have the capability of intelligent life, even if that intelligent life will not arise for billions of years. Now that could mean that that planet could be kept in quarantine and not visited.
Ian, what do you think about this zoo hypothesis and also of our sort of evolving opinion on where to search for life?
I must confess that, as you say, the idea of Earth being in some sort of quarantine, a reserve situation is fairly common in SF terms. It's not one I've ever been convinced by, although I've read many entertaining stories that include that. Another aspect and another thing, and you almost touched upon it when you were speaking just now, is that when you consider how long we as a race have lived on the Earth, it's a fraction of the time that the Earth has been here. When you then consider that for how much of human history we've actually been aware of other planets, it's an even smaller fraction. When you then consider how much of human civilization, for how much time we've been searching for life, when you look at these other planets, even if we find one that looks Earth-like, that sits within quote-unquote the Goldilocks sort of band, which stands every chance of supporting life, the actual period during which any form of intelligent life would have arisen is so small in that planet's history that the chances of the signs of that life, if they have reached a technological level where they're creating some sort of signal that we're going to understand, reaching us in the limited period we've been looking, decades that we've been looking, is minute.
Exactly, and if we're searching for signals of extraterrestrial civilizations, we shouldn't forget that we've been doing so for just several decades.
Yes.
It's a mere speck of time in the length of universe's age. And also our technology is slowly developing and we don't know exactly what to look for. There are many hypotheses, for example, to look in the H band or try to find some focused beams directed to us if someone wanted to communicate directly with Earth. But the chances of actually detecting that are quite low. And we haven't built such a vast array of radio telescopes that we should be certain that we would detect such a signal if someone directed it at us. And of course, directing it would be expensive and difficult, and we have tried to send narrow beams with signals, for example, from the Arecibo telescope in the 70s. And actually, when Douglas Vakoch from SETI and METI programs sent not just this transmission, but also several other messages to aliens, to world scientists to decode them, most of them weren't able to do it. So even if we detected it, how can we be sure that we're receiving a message and not some noise? And if it were a message, can we decode it or not?
Yes, and I go along with you that it may not be radio. I think that's very presumptuous that we'd be looking at radio. If I remember correctly with Arecibo, and someone can fact check me on this because I'm not sure, so I'm sort of half remembering and I may be remembering incorrectly. But if I have a vague recollection that if there was a twin of Arecibo on another world, and it was targeted at Earth and ours was targeted at it, I think the communication distance is only something like 500 light years if they knew in advance precisely where each other were and lined themselves up. And 500 light years is not much in a galaxy that is 100,000 light years across. So I don't think that we would be able to eavesdrop on their Wi-Fi or whatever. So I'm not convinced about that. I think we could be missing them and not seeing them.
My greatest, I mean, the Fermi paradox is a famous paradox, as you alluded to when we started. But I think, to me, the greatest achievement of the Fermi paradox is to give science fiction writers something to write about, because it asks this great question. And as you said, I put together an anthology, which I called Paradox, and it's very difficult to actually interpret what that was about. And what I did, I approached a number of top SF authors, and I also approached several scientists. And I got David Clements, who's an astrophysicist at Imperial College, and I got Rachel Armstrong. And if anyone's heard Rachel talk, well, if you haven't, go and find her and see her talk. She's amazing. She's an architectural biologist, and she's currently a professor at Newcastle University, but she goes all over the world and lectures and talks. And I got them to write stories exploring the Fermi paradox, along with Mike Resnick and Paul Cornell and Pat Cadigan and various other science fiction authors. And I got this incredible array of stories, none of which actually directly addressed the Fermi paradox, but they all took it and ran with it in a different direction. And I was really pleased with it. And it's amazing to see how that book's been received, because a lot of people have loved it and really enjoyed it. But a lot of people came back and said, this is an awful book. None of the stories answer the Fermi paradox. What if they could answer the Fermi paradox? So it wasn't intended, but it's been quite interesting to see its polarized reactions. A lot of people have absolutely loved the book, and a lot seemed to think that I was setting out to answer the paradox, and I wasn't. I was just... it's a wonderful riff for science fiction writers to play off and for ideas to spark.
Well,
Exactly. Sorry.
I do go along with your idea that science feeds science fiction, and after all, science fiction has science in the term. I go along with that totally. Now, you're a bit too young, Ian, to remember this, but back in the 19...
Oh, thank you, flatterer.
I've just got this past week my old age bus pass, so I'm feeling I can travel throughout London free, which is excellent. But you're too young to remember that back in the late 70s, there were some rather well-known authors who I will not name, who were going around saying that the science fiction genre was wearing out, and that we had done everything, and that you had, going back into the 1950s, Isaac Asimov and robots, and then you had a more sophisticated approach of robotics and artificial intelligence and the Forbin Project, this, that, and the other, and then right up to the present, bearing in mind this was in the 1970s, where the theme was subverted and made fun of, and you had Marvin the paranoid android, and this was, the whole idea was that science fiction was running out of steam and dying. And I thought this was a load of codswallop, because the thing is about science fiction is that science is continually advancing, and we're constantly getting new ideas and so forth, which writers such as Ian and yours can explore.
Exactly, and also it's to their mutual benefit. I mean, science feeds science fiction with new ideas, and science fiction can explore scientific ideas to the extent that scientists can't do on the pages of scientific journals, because it would be too much speculation, too little data, and it wouldn't go through peer review. And actually, when we're trying to answer the Fermi paradox, we've been discussing mainly the optimistic options like the zoo hypothesis, or that other civilizations wouldn't want to venture into the galaxy, or possibly that it's hard, almost impossible to travel between the stars, or life is very different from what we expect. These are still the very optimistic hypotheses, and the more pessimistic one is called the great filter, and it may basically mean several things. Either we have gone through the filter, it's behind us, and it may be the origin of life, or origin of complex life, or intelligence. Any of that might be very rare, or the filter is ahead of us. For example, too often self-destruction of technological civilizations, etc., or some predatory species that was the first to colonize the galaxy and tries to extinguish all of the other ones. And science fiction has explored all of these ideas to a very large extent. I guess in the paradox there are several stories on that too.
Oh, there are stories about sort of races, as you say, going through extinguishing. Paul de Filippo wrote a wonderful, trashy pulp story about this thing just going through and obliterating races and life, which was wonderful. But yet all these things are possible. I mean, the older I get, the more cynical and crotchety I get. And the more that these wonderful stories I read in the 70s no longer hold particular credence for me. And I think that there are all sorts of explanations, probably ones we haven't even thought of yet, which, but this is the thing, as you say, I mean, I was on the Radio 4 Today programme a few years ago, and one of the questions they asked me is, surely, with all that science is doing, science fiction has nowhere to go. And that is just so ludicrous, because until we know absolutely everything there is to know about everything, there'll always be room for science fiction. And even when we do know everything there is to know about everything, which will never happen, by the way, but then we can still have fun with what we do know. So we've always got places to go.
Yeah, and science fiction inspires scientists and entrepreneurs. I mean, people like Elon Musk were science fiction fans in their childhood.
I've got a brief story on that, and that this is something, I've probably said this at half the talks and interviews I've ever been in, so apologies if you've heard me say this before. But I was at a talk at the British Library a couple of years ago, and Neil Gaiman told a story which I thought was wonderful, and that he kept getting invited over to China to science fiction conventions, and they were treated like stars. Not just him, Kim Stanley Robinson, authors from Britain and America were taken over there. And he turned around to one of the organisers at one stage and said, how can you afford to keep bringing all these authors from Britain and America? And said, oh, we don't do it. It's all sponsored by the state. And Neil said, well, why the state doing it? And he said, well, going back 10 years ago, China were producing some of the most fantastic technology in the world, but we weren't inventing it. We were taking what America was doing, what Britain was doing, what other countries are doing, taking it apart. Once we'd done that, we could reproduce it better than the originals. We were great at that, but we weren't innovating. So we sent delegations across to America and to Britain to talk to all the people there. And he said, and we spoke to the head of Google, we spoke to people in all the Microsoft, in all the top companies, and we discovered that all of them, the one thing we could find in common was that they'd all been science fiction fans. And so we want to stimulate a science fiction fandom to get the innovation, because we think that's what stimulates innovation.
Yeah, and science fiction can inspire us and also inspire the science, sort of bleed through into the real world.
I don't know, by the way, if that's true, but I like to think it is.
Sometimes things...
I was going to say Carl Sagan, who some of you may have heard of, the great cosmologist, who was the husband to Lynn Margulis, who...
and the symbiotic theory.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, Carl Sagan specifically referred to science and science fiction as doing a dance. So I totally agree with that. And since you plugged your book, I'm going to plug something that I did, which is not as great as Ian's marvelous book, because mine was earlier.
I'm not paying him, honestly. I'm not. It's just.
I had a letter published in Nature 2 weeks ago. It was only a short letter, because 2 weeks prior to that, the journal Nature had a special edition, which was a science fiction edition. They had all the usual research papers, this, that, and the other, but they had a sort of dozen pages, and it was to mark H.G. Wells' double anniversary, which is this year. because 150 years ago H.G. Wells was born, and 70 years ago H.G. Wells died. And they had a great big discussion about the social relevance, etc., and meaning of the War of the Worlds, which you're all aware of the story of the War of the Worlds. Anyway, you flip on through that edition of Nature and you come to the science pages, and before you get to the research articles, you have the science news. And one of the news was about the Curiosity rover, which is currently on Mars. And they want to go to a bit of strata in a crater, but to get there, they have to pass by some bits which they now think may have briny water in the sediment. And if there's briny water in the sediment, if there is Martian life, they're not allowed to go there by international convention because the Curiosity rover was not sterilized. It's what we call specific pathogen free, which means it's clean, but it's not sterile. So they're actually going to have to alter the path the Curiosity takes, and it's going to have to go the long way around, which, will it survive the distance and all the rest of it to get there? And I pointed out in my letter, which appeared 2 weeks ago, that they were talking on one page about H.G. Wells' War of the World, in which the Martians were killed in the end by Earth's microbes. And then a few pages on, we were talking about the threat of Earth microbes possibly on the Curiosity rover that hadn't been sterilized by all the radiation and so forth, getting there and this and that, possibly contaminating a Martian microbial habitat. And there was quite a bit of symmetry in this.
And planetary protection is an exciting topic, and if I may do a little promo, I should have an article about planetary protection in Clark's World in the December issue, if Kate Baker puts it there, or maybe in January. And it will be especially about Mars, considering the recent plans of SpaceX and also the race for Mars that it started. And Lockheed Martin is now pushing NASA for its Mars base camp, etc. But going back to the Fermi paradox, which mainly considers...
I'd forgotten about that.
intelligent civilizations.
Shall we ask the audience to vote? Very quickly. We can do it. What would be the question? The question would be how many of you believe that we are the only intelligent species in the galaxy? Hands up. Right now. So
very few.
Very few.
Yeah, I see some free hands.
How many think that in the galaxy there are other as intelligent or more intelligent than us? Oh, well.
Yeah, it's the vast majority.
We can't argue against that. We won't get out alive.
Yeah.
So
we should continue with this topic. And actually, where science fiction bleeds into science is, for example, METI or active SETI, messaging to extraterrestrial intelligences. And it's an effort mainly by Douglas Vakoch, formerly from the SETI, and he wants to send actively signals into space, target prospective stellar systems with them. And it sparked a large debate where, for example, Stephen Hawking argued against it because of how inadvisable it might be if we encountered an enemy civilization or just accidentally offended some civilization that would have the means to get here. And personally, it seems like the risk is quite low because if there were civilizations capable of sending ships with living beings throughout the galaxy and they were in our vicinity, we would very likely see them because all of the exhaust from their ships would shine almost like stars. And if there were any ships going into our own systems, well, we should see them braking, because if they were approaching at any speed nearing the speed of light, just 10% or something like that, they would need to brake a lot to get here.
But that's assuming they weren't using some form of exotic physics. And
yeah.
I've noticed with physicists, in biology, we've got lots of things we have in biology. We can do smut and we can do all sorts of lovely things. But physicists, if they don't understand anything, just stick the word dark in front of it. So you see, there's 98% of the universe, we don't know what it's made of, so we'll call it dark matter. And there's an energy field, etc. Oh, we don't know what that is, we'll call that dark energy. And of course, This could be the exhaust, whatever it is you're talking about.
No professional rivalry between disciplines whatsoever. We all live in harmony.
If travel was easier than that, it's more compelling argument for they should already be here. So why aren't they?
Absolutely. Well, I mean,
actually,
who's to say they're not? Perhaps they're trying to culturally educate us through encouraging science fiction, and maybe some of the committee of the Eurocon.
You know Ian too. Yes.
Yeah. Well, people have always said that I'm like a Vulcan. But actually, an optimistic scenario of why they might be near and we don't know about them is that they would simply prefer another environment, because who's to say that most civilizations come from planets like the Earth, or that civilizations coming from planets like the Earth stay in such environments, because, for example, asteroid belts offer great resources for mining, especially in terms of metals. Giant planets offer great possibilities of extracting helium from them and other gases that we might need in interstellar exploration. And places like the Kuiper Belt or Oort cloud might be good for sort of interstellar hopping to another star, because the Oort cloud, the sphere consisting of comets and other small icy bodies, might extend more than 1 light year away from the sun. And if Proxima Centauri has its own Oort cloud, then we would have sort of these little islands on the way if it were impossible or just too difficult to go the distance just one way. And who's to say that civilizations don't adapt to these environments and start preferring them? And if we had some alien bases in our Oort cloud, we wouldn't know about that, because there are no direct observations of the outer Oort. We only know about the long period comets coming into our inner system, and we're still discovering lots of bodies in the near Kuiper Belt, dwarf planets and such. And there's so much we don't know about them, and our statistic of them is so little that we really aren't sure what to expect, and if a civilization preferred these environments, we wouldn't be able to find it. What do you think?
I think all those are quite reasonable, quite reasonable scenarios. And there's also the possibility that biological intelligence has a certain limit, which is the limit of the frailty of animal life, which only lives for a certain period of time, and maybe artificial intelligence. And you can think of things like Ian Banks's. Have you read Ian Banks's Culture series? Some of you may have. Have you read Ian Banks's Culture series? 1 or 2 people have. He's quite a well-known Scottish author in Britain. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He was meant to be guest of honour at one of the guest of honours at LonCon, the WorldCon in 2014, but sadly missed it by a few months. He was rather ill. But in his Hippies in Space, ultra-advanced, almost utopian civilization, the sentient humanoid aliens actually, behind the scenes, they're really controlled by these artificial brains and intelligence and drones, which can either be self-moving units or they can be part of huge, giant, many-mile-long spaceships. And of course, if you start having intelligences which are more machine-based, they're not constrained by the limitations of biological time periods, and perhaps could enter into the astrogeological time frames needed to cross distance between stars and so forth, etc. But we wouldn't recognize them as being life.
Or on the contrary, if it was possible to move into, let's say, silicon chips and simulate our consciousness in a computer, then we wouldn't need any biological or big robot bodies at all. And Greg Egan's Diaspora books and short stories are actually a good example of that. imagine a whole civilization living on a chip the size of a speck of dust. And we wouldn't, of course, be able to detect any of that, and their time frames might be much longer or shorter than ours, depending on the computing power.
Well, barring, I think you termed it exotic technology, the idea of stargates or of wormholes and things like this, the only way that we as human beings will ever cross the stars, the only two ways are one, in some sort of cryogenic situation taking many, many years, or on generation starships. And the more likely scenario, which I think is, I could actually envisage this happening, is that we actually, rather than going as we are, we adapt, as you say, either in some downloaded form or in hugely altered form. I mentioned the fact I published Rachel Armstrong in the Paradox Anthology. She's somebody who's actually created artificial cells and miniature life forms, completely artificially created, that act as if they're alive in every single shape and form. And she's part of a long-term project called the 100 Years Spaceship Project, which is looking, in very practical terms, to 100 years from now, well, I think about 97 years from now, but basically 100 years' time, to have a starship that could actually colonize the stars with Earth life, which is genetically related to us, but isn't necessarily human, because they're trying to put out there a form of life that could survive the journey, and that probably wouldn't look anything like us.
And that's when the aliens will come and say, hang on a second, you're littering. Yes. This we will not allow.
Yeah, it raises the concern of planetary protection of other systems, not just Mars or Europa or Enceladus. We have the last 5 minutes. Is there anything you would like to say that we haven't said it, or questions from the audience? Yes?
Berserkers.
Yeah. That's basically the predatory species hypothesis, only with artificial means. And in science fiction, it has been explored, for example, in Alastair Reynolds' Revelation Space series. Another question? Okay, if we don't have questions... Oh, yeah, there's a question. Well, it depends where it would be. Again, just having a large solar wind doesn't mean that the planet wouldn't be able to retain an atmosphere, although it would lower the chances. And if the planet was, I don't know if you meant solar winds or winds in the planet's atmosphere, but considering the atmosphere, if the planet was tidally locked, it doesn't have to have large wind speeds. And of course, we can consider a civilization under the surface or in the sea, although it would be difficult to imagine from our point of view.
I have a feeling a few months back there was a exo-Earth discovered orbiting in the Goldilocks zone of a red dwarf. And I have a vague recollection, and when I always do say if I have a vague recollection, because I don't like to bullshit. And so maybe
you could have fooled me.
Well, I can, obviously. I have a vague recollection that there was some work done that showed that even though the star was a variable, it could...
There are actually lots of models on the possibilities of life or life-supporting environments on planets near red dwarfs. Several studies were published after the discovery of Proxima Centauri b, which is the most recent exoplanet discovery. That means the so-called second Earth. We should not try to picture really Earth, because we don't know the planet's properties. We know its minimum mass, which is about 1.2 mass of Earth, so it might be similar, but it also might be much higher. And it isn't transiting, so we don't know its size, and we have no idea whether it has an atmosphere or what composition it might have. And there are so many possibilities we might consider. And basically, to wrap it up, the universe might be even weirder than we think, and planets have been discovered in multiple star systems. I think the 5-star system with planets is the largest one so far, and we have discovered planetary systems packed closely together, almost like the system of Saturn's moons. We have discovered planets near stars of much higher mass than the Sun, and of course also in near lower mass stars similar to brown dwarfs. And the era when we'll be able to assess the planet's properties will come soon, for example, with the James Webb Space Telescope. And it seems we are out of time, so I would like to thank my panelists, Ian and Jonathan, and thank you for attending the panel. And I'd like to invite you for my tomorrow's talk on the possibilities of life on Venus in the past and perhaps in the present and future. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any other intelligent civilization in our galaxy, because if they invented means to travel between the stars, even with speeds much lower than the speed of light, they should be able to colonize the galaxy in mere millions of years. So where are they? We haven't detected any signal, we haven't found any probe, we haven't met any aliens or anything like that. And there are many possible hypotheses trying to explain this question and this lack of evidence of alien civilizations in our galaxy. And before we start tackling the question, I would like to introduce the panelists. So on my right is Ian Waite. He's a very prolific author and editor of speculative fiction. He wrote 6 novels, many short stories, and
inherent in the Fermi paradox. The first assumption is that the aliens will want to colonize the galaxy. And that assumption is born of the fact that our civilization, our technical civilization, has been built upon long-term quasi-exponential growth. If there are any demographers amongst you, you'll realize why I said quasi. But our population has grown and our energy use per capita has grown with time, with a huge surge around the time of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, we went through a phase in the mid-1970s where the population growth was super exponential. That is, there was exponential growth on it. The exponential growth was itself growing. And this has coloured our thinking, because wherever you are...
do you consider most likely to explain it?
Oh, gosh. But if Ian first. Well, as a scientist, I must actually, first of all, declare that I'm completely biased, because I'm also a science fiction enthusiast.
Maybe closer.
I'm also a science fiction enthusiast, and I would really like it that there would be lots of aliens out there. So I'm aware that within me there is a conscious bias. However, I do think that if you actually look at the question of the Fermi paradox closely, when we were at school, we were always taught experimentation, hypothesis, experimentation, conclusion, and you must always list your assumptions. And I think that there are quite a few assumptions.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to the Where Are the Aliens panel. In this panel, we'll tackle the famous Fermi paradox, as it's often called. And the question is already in the title of the panel. And we might wonder, where are all the aliens if there ever had been dated more than 30 anthologies, including one anthology on the Fermi paradox? And he is the director of the British Science Fiction Association.
Yes.
And on my left is Jonathan Cowie. He's an environmental scientist and science communicator, also very prolific. And most recently, he published a second edition of his book, Climate Change, Biological and Human Aspects. And Earth system science and climate change in particular are the topics he engages in most. And he is also a member of the Science Fact and Science Fiction, and I hope I pronounced this right, concatenation? Yes.
Concatenation, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to start with you. What's your view of the Fermi paradox, and what hypothesis do you